"What's an old black man like you doing here?" The officer sneered, stepping out of the squad car, his sharp eyes scanning Luther Grant as if he were nothing more than a stain on the pavement. They didn't ask his name. They didn't care. To them, he was just another faceless nobody, loitering outside an establishment where they believed he didn't belong. A high-end restaurant, a place of wealth and exclusivity, certainly not meant for a man like him, or so they thought. Without a second thought, they threw him into the back of their squad car, their laughter thick with arrogance as they mocked him in the holding cell. They jeered when he warned them. "You're making a mistake." To them it was funny. What kind of mistake could an old black man like him mean? They saw him as just another shadow on the streets, someone who should fear them, someone whose words held no weight. But what they failed to realize, what they never even bothered to check, was that the man they had just arrested wasn't some vagrant. He wasn't just another name lost in their system. He was Luther Grant, a retired Supreme Court justice. And when he made his one phone call, it wouldn't be to some public defender scrambling for a case. It would be to the Chief Justice of the United States. By the time the officers realized the gravity of their mistake, the damage would already be done. Because this time, the man they had tried to silence, the man they had dismissed without a second thought, was the very same man who had once written the laws they had just broken. Before we go any further, let me know where in the world you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story is one you do not want to miss. The city pulsed with an unspoken arrogance, a quiet hum of wealth that settled into the very foundation of its streets. Towering glass buildings loomed above, their polished surfaces reflecting the glow of the streetlights below. At the very heart of it all stood the Hamilton, a restaurant that didn't just serve food, it served status. This was a place where tables were reserved with whispered names, where the exclusivity wasn't just about the price but about who you were. The doormen stood like sentinels, their gazes sharp and unyielding, as if they were guarding the threshold between privilege and those who simply did not belong. Luther Grant stood just beyond that entrance, wrapped in the quiet patience of a man who had seen too much to be in a hurry. He had arrived early as he always did, preferring to collect his thoughts rather than rush through life the way younger men often did. Inside, his granddaughter Claire was still at her event, dining with her colleagues from Georgetown Law, a gathering he had politely declined, giving her the space to navigate the world of ambition on her own. "Take your time," he had told her. "I'll be right here when you're ready." So he waited. His gaze drifted across the street, watching as taxis slipped through the traffic, as sleek luxury cars eased toward the valet. For the first time in years, he allowed himself the simple leisure of standing unnoticed. No cameras, no whispered recognition, no eyes trailing his every move. And yet, every so often, a passerby would glance his way, brows knitting together as though trying to place his face. They knew him, they just couldn't quite remember from where. That was fine. Anonymity had its own kind of power. Across the street, however, someone else had noticed him. A squad car idled at the curb, its engine rumbling low against the night air. The two officers inside had been watching him for a while now. Their conversation had tapered off, their easy laughter fading into something sharper, something colder. A quiet exchange of glances, an understanding passed between them. They had already made up their minds. Officer Jake Rower drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. His gaze locked onto the elderly black man standing alone in front of the restaurant. "Look at this guy," he muttered, shaking his head with a smirk tugging at his lips. "They always find their way into places they don't belong." Beside him, Brent Kincaid, older, more seasoned, exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "I swear they're getting bolder every year," he murmured, his tone carrying the weight of unspoken assumptions. "Bet you anything he's waiting to hit someone up for cash. Probably tailing one of these rich folks when they leave." Rower let out a quiet chuckle, already pushing open the car door. "Guess we better make sure he doesn't get too comfortable." Kincaid followed, adjusting his belt as they strode across the street with the slow, deliberate steps of men who had never had to question their authority. They expected obedience before they had even spoken a word. But Luther Grant did not turn when he heard them approach. He did not flinch when the voice, thick with unchecked confidence, rang out behind him. "Sir, we're going to need you to move along." He inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the moment settle around him before finally shifting his gaze toward the two officers standing in front of him. Rower stood with a smirk curling at the edge of his mouth. His posture too relaxed, the stance of a man who enjoyed moments like these. Kincaid rested his hands on his belt, his fingers brushing the grip of his baton. His expression carried quiet amusement, as though he had already decided how this exchange would end. Luther held their gaze, his voice smooth, steady, unshaken by the weight of their stares. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter," he said simply. Rower's smirk widened. He tilted his head, letting out a small scoff, dragging out the syllables like a man humoring a child's excuse. "See, that's the thing," he drawled. "You've been standing here for a while. Now, we've had a few complaints about suspicious activity." The words left the officer's mouth slow, deliberate, laced with the false authority of someone who had never once questioned their own judgment. "Can't have people loitering outside a nice place like this." Luther Grant met his gaze, unwavering. He didn't blink. "Suspicious activity," he echoed, his voice smooth, devoid of surprise. Because why would he need to ask? He already knew exactly what they meant. Kincaid exhaled through his nose, shaking his head as if this entire conversation were nothing more than an inconvenience to him. "Just move along, all right? We won't ask twice." Luther did not move. He did not argue. Instead, with the same patience he had spent a lifetime refining, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat. His movements measured, precise, slow enough to make it clear he wasn't a threat. From inside, he retrieved his wallet, holding it out steadily. "I assume you'll want to see some identification then?" For a moment, a brief, flickering moment, there was hesitation. Kincaid's jaw tightened just slightly, a crack in his confidence that showed itself in the smallest of ways. Annoyance flickered across his face, a sliver of irritation at the audacity of the man standing before him. He glanced at Rower. The smirk that had once played at Rower's lips was gone, replaced by something harder, something far less amused. And then, without warning, Rower lashed out, slapping the wallet from Luther's hand. It hit the pavement with a dull thud, landing just beside the curb. Bills fluttered out, crisp and neatly folded, along with a few credit cards that slid across the cold concrete. Luther did not flinch. For the first time, his expression shifted. Not to anger, not to fear, something else. A stillness so unnerving, so practiced, that it became something more than silence. Kincaid stepped forward, placing his boot deliberately over the wallet, pressing it down into the pavement. A sneer played at the edges of his mouth. "Didn't ask for ID," he muttered, his voice low. Rower let out a short, humorless chuckle. "You got a problem following directions, old man?" Luther's hands remained at his sides, his shoulders squared, his posture unyielding. He did not look down at the wallet crushed beneath Kincaid's boot. He did not look at Rower's smug expression. Instead, he let the moment stretch between them, let the weight of their actions settle in the air. And then, in a voice calm, certain, immovable, he spoke. "You are making a mistake." Kincaid exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to carry an edge of quiet menace. "Yeah," he smirked. "And what exactly do you think is gonna happen here, huh?" Luther's gaze did not waver. "You're going to find out." For just a second, a fraction of a second, the air around them shifted. Something neither officer could quite name. Something unspoken, yet undeniable. A warning. One they were far too arrogant to recognize. Because they had already decided how this would end. And they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Luther remained exactly where he was, his posture as composed as ever. His eyes locked on Kincaid's sneering gaze. The weight of the moment settled between them like a stone, thick with the kind of tension that only ignorance and unchecked authority could create. The officers were waiting for him to break. They wanted to see the first sign of defiance, the first flicker of resistance, anything they could twist into an excuse, into justification. But Luther Grant had spent a lifetime studying men like these. Men who mistook power for righteousness. Men who confused authority with wisdom. He would not give them what they wanted. Kincaid pressed his boot down harder, grinding the wallet into the pavement, his lips curling at the edges, daring Luther to protest. "You're not hearing us, old man," he said, his voice dripping with the easy confidence of someone who had never once faced consequences. "You've got about 3 seconds to start walking before we make you." Luther did not move, did not blink. His voice, when he spoke, was as steady as stone. "I have already told you. I am waiting for my granddaughter. I am standing on a public sidewalk. You have no legal grounds to remove me." Rower laughed sharply, stepping closer, too close, until Luther could smell the faint mix of cheap cologne and stale coffee on his breath. "Oh, we don't." Rower's grin widened. His fingers twitched at his belt. "See, I don't think you understand how this works. You don't get to tell us what we can and can't do." Beside him, Kincaid nudged the wallet aside with the edge of his boot, watching as one of Luther's credit cards slid out onto the pavement. A glint of plastic against the concrete. Kincaid smirked. "That's funny." He crouched slightly, just enough to tilt his head. "A guy like you hanging around a place like this. Alone. This late." He nudged the card again. "Bet if I ran that, we'd find out it's stolen." The accusation sat between them. Absurd. Deliberate. And yet, delivered with such ease. As if it was routine. As if neither of them expected to be challenged. Luther let out a slow breath. Not from anger, no. Anger was a luxury he had long since learned to set aside. No, what filled him now was something colder. Something older. Something tempered by decades of knowing exactly how moments like this unfolded. He straightened just slightly, his hands still at his sides, his voice quiet, measured, and carrying all the weight of certainty. "I suggest you rethink what you are about to do." For a moment, just a flicker, Kincaid's smirk faltered, barely perceptible. But Rower stepped forward, filling the silence with,